to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello everyone, it's so good to be back with you. Welcome to Season 6 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Dr Lyn O'Grady is a community psychologist with a particular interest in the mental health and well-being of children and adolescents. She currently works in private practice in Melbourne and is a consultant and trainer in the areas of child and adolescent mental health, suicide prevention, and school psychology. She began her career working in the 1990s in parent education while studying psychology. She has also worked as a school psychologist and managed the Kids Matter National Mental Health Initiative for the Australian Psychological Society. She's also the author of Keeping Our Kids Alive, Parenting a Suicidal Young Person. And she has a Facebook page for parents. Please be advised that this episode contains discussions around suicide. This is a painful topic, and reasons can be both varied and extremely complex. If you find this topic distressing, please reach out for support or contact Lifeline at 13 11 14 or whichever helpline is in your own country. Hello, Lyn. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Hi, Collett. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's lovely to talk to you today.
I'm so grateful for your experience, and this is not an easy topic to talk about, and we need people like you to just help us as parents, even as practitioners, to just navigate this area where I think there can be so many myths and misconceptions. So Lyn, I'd love you to start with just telling us a little bit about what led to your work in the area that you work in, working with young people who are struggling with suicidal thinking. And also, I know you wrote a book, so tell us a little bit about where that all started.
Yeah, well, it feels like in many ways it's life's work of coming together in the book. And it is a topic that I guess I've been involved in different ways back from the 90s with parents and parents of teenagers in projects at the community level, and would sometimes come across parents who were experiencing difficulties with their teenagers, and suicide was one of those things, or suicide risk was one of those concerns that parents had. So I was studying psychology at that stage, so I was sort of working and doing this work and trying to, do my best of supporting parents with that, and would often find it pretty frustrating that they were needing help and the help kind of wasn't there. And sometimes, their young people would be sent to hospital and then come home, and the parents were left with the responsibility of that, and then, trying to keep the young person safe. And then the same pattern would happen. And then I moved into working in schools, and again, the same suicide risk would come up, sometimes death by suicide of people in the school community. I'd be involved in some of those responses, and they were the most devastating pieces of that work in terms of responding to crises in schools. And I always worried about it, always felt, again, frustrated by why aren't we sort of able to prevent suicide, and why aren't we doing better at this? And then I moved into a decade of doing more project work with the Australian Psychological Society, and that was bigger picture project work. And suicide prevention would still come up, and people were still saying, but what do we do? How do we handle this? And so it just kept emerging in all these different places, I suppose. So 2015, I decided I just wanted to tackle it. Let's try and find out more. Let's just try and understand it. So I enrolled in the Master of Suicidology course, which was a 3-year online part-time course, the only one in the world, I think, that is a master's program in suicide prevention, suicidology. And so the more I studied in that 3-year period, the more that was obvious that there's no one answer here. So I thought, well, I need to bring things together. So do some writing. I know about parents back from the 90s and having done that work for such a long time in different ways. And now I've got this new awareness, at least, around suicidology. So why don't I just begin? So that's what I did that weekend. I sat down in the coffee shop where I do most of my writing, which was a problem in COVID, of course, when I couldn't go to coffee shops. Sat down and just began just writing it, pulling in different parts of what I'd learnt, researching bits and pieces, trying to think about what is it that parents need to know, really. And of course, it got released right at the start of COVID. So April 2020, it was released. And that was just as Australia was going into its lockdowns and COVID was really hitting. So that was where I then thought I need to develop up something else to kind of reach out to people. So the Facebook page was developed in that sort of environment then. Now I've got about 10,000 followers, and it formed its own little community as well. And I tried to make that page as positive as possible. So it doesn't have very much about suicide per se. It's very much around how do we parent well, how do we understand what's happening, how do we make sense of things, what resources are out there, how do we just sort of support each other. So that's been the work that I've been doing there, and use the book in my private practice work as well. So it's pretty handy to have if I am working with parents who are concerned about suicide risk with their kids.
Yeah, wonderful resource. So, Lyn, what do we know at the moment about suicide prevention and young people?
Yeah, look, it's an area that we're still really working hard to understand, I think. So we've been concerned about youth suicide for decades, but we're also seeing younger children. And so the numbers of younger children and suicide deaths is actually rising. So if we think about suicide prevention broadly with all ages, we know that there can be like 200 risk factors that have been identified. And we haven't done, there's not as much research on protective factors. It's kind of harder to research that, I guess, in terms of what is protective. With younger children and adolescents, there's a lot that we don't know because they're often excluded from research. It's harder to engage young people and children in research. There's a whole lot of ethical concerns. So we're not hearing the voices. And we also know that when there's assessment tools used by parents to talk about how they think their children are distressed or their adolescents are distressed, and I see this in my private practice work as well, they're often underreported. So when you are able to use a tool that does, or you're having conversations with children, you're getting very different perspectives. So the child can be quite distressed and anxious and worried about things, and the parent often has no idea about that. But what we do know is those risk and protective factors for children and young people are very much around family and school settings. So that's becoming clearer, I guess. And we know that Indigenous children, young people are overrepresented in those statistics. That's across the board as well. For adults, men, the male deaths by suicide are much higher than women, but suicide attempts are higher in women. So that's been the case for quite a long time. And there's lots of discussions around what that might mean and what we need to do to support both genders and perhaps look at it differently. In boys and girls, that gap's not quite as high. I mean, statistically, the numbers are lower, so it's harder to tease those things out. But typically, girls are engaged in suicidal behaviours as much as boys, really.
Suicide is one of the leading causes of death in young people. It's a complex issue, and there are many factors that we talk about as risk factors, which we will mention further along in this episode. As you listen, you may think that some of the risk factors in young people seem similar to those in adults. So then why are teen suicide rates higher? The only answer I can give you is that we don't have a definitive answer. The teen years are a difficult time, particularly for minority groups and vulnerable people. As you've heard many times on this podcast, their brains are still developing, and they also don't have as much life experience to draw on as adults do.
And there's an emerging concern around young women as well, increasing deaths by young women, even into the 20s now, and particularly in children, the gap's just not there. You know, we need to take it all seriously, I guess, is the point around that. But we also need to be thinking about what is it that might be different between genders, but also we know that LGBTQ people are much more at risk of suicide. So we need to look at this in the complexity of it, I guess, in terms of understanding it. So we know that for children, the most influential places for them and young people are family and schools. So we kind of need to look at it in that way. And we also know across the board that it's not one thing that is actually going to lead a person to dying by suicide or attempting suicide, even though there can be like a trigger point or the last thing that kind of happened that tipped that person from maybe thinking about it into action. And it's really difficult. We can't predict that. It's very difficult to predict who might be thinking about suicide and then who will act on that and who will then act in a way that is going to be so dangerous that they die. So we're not able to predict that, and that's been the case for a long time. So we have to kind of work with people trying to be as protective as possible. So things like safety plans are really important, making sure that people around the child or young person are aware of what's going on for them, that they are in some degree of distress. And sometimes waiting and focusing on adolescence is not the best way to go, because even in my own practice, some of the teenagers I see have actually been hurting themselves or having thoughts about dying for years, since childhood, but they've never necessarily voiced that. And then, of course, they get to adolescence and things might escalate, or suddenly people start to worry about it more. So, and Kids Helpline data tells us that as well. And that was another driver for me to decide I need to write the book and I need to make sure that adults are more aware of this, because Kids Helpline data was released in 2016 that did show that even young children from the age of 7 were ringing Kids Helpline and have been trying to tell adults how they were feeling, that they had thoughts about suicide or even a plan or had even tempted to hurt themselves, but adults hadn't heard them. So then for some of these kids, they were then able to ring Kids Helpline and have someone hear them. So I'd seen a bit of that when I worked in schools as school psychologist back in before 2010 when I left that to go and do other work. But I'd started to see some of that even in primary schools. So I kind of feel like we need to make sure adults are aware of all of this and understanding how serious this can be, and that suicidality can be about distress. And if we understand it in that way, we want to catch that as early as possible and have an environment where children, young people can be heard, can get support to deal with what their problems are, and that's taken seriously, that we don't get to the point that then suicide becomes thought about or becomes, considered in any way.
So, Lyn, we often hear this myth that if a young person talks about suicide or even makes some kind of attempt, that it's attention-seeking behavior. Can you talk into that a little bit, and what might be going on for a young person when they are thinking about suicide?
Yeah, I think it is that distress. I think it can become a way of feeling so helpless and not knowing what else to do. So I think it is a way of them trying to let adults know that they need help. And if we minimize it or we see it as attention seeking in a negative way and then we ignore it or punish it, we're really doing a disservice and in fact increasing a risk factor for that person. So I think it is very common that people see that, and certainly it becomes part of the conversation sometimes where young people might say, well, if you don't do this or you don't do that, or if that happens, I'm going to hurt myself or kill myself. And that can be incredibly confronting for parents. So some of the work that I do with parents is to help them to hear the distress and recognise that that's the distress and try to be working on how do we problem solve and help with that. But then how do we manage the situation when the young person is saying that and not getting into a power struggle about that? So finding ways to say, I really want you to be safe. We need to keep you safe. I'm hearing that you're really upset. So it comes down to communication, parenting skills. So sometimes there's a change in attitude, change in behaviour, which is often challenging to know, is this a change that is part of being an adolescent or part of their development that's very, very normal, or is this a change that's indicating that there's a problem? So that's the first tricky part. But parents are often can pick up pretty well and be concerned for quite a while before they necessarily do think this is an actual problem. And so for some people, and there might be some gender differences here, so there might be like a withdrawing, there might be a shutting down, a more internalizing kind of response where someone's withdrawing from their normal activities, so like a depressive kind of response, or there can be more of an acting out kind of response as well. So it changes, I guess, in that sense of there's something not quite right here. They used to enjoy doing something, now they're not, or they, used to come and talk to me about things and now they're not, spending a lot of time kind of on their own. So that distance can be a sign. Saying things, like the giving up, that kind of not sort of wanting to do things, not that sense of future. And that can be something that comes through in different things that they say. Well, I don't care about that. Or, it doesn't matter anyway next year. Who cares about next year? So it can be those kind of flippant comments, but sometimes it can be actual very don't want to be here, or don't care about that because I'll be dead next year. Or it can be those kinds of comments that can catch parents by surprise and can be quite hard in the moment to kind of know what to do. And again, that can be then the shutting down for parents can be around that's just attention seeking, or you don't mean that, or don't be ridiculous, can be really, really unhelpful, instead of curiosity around when you say that, what do you mean? What's that? What do you mean when you say that? And opening up the conversation.
Some of the risk factors might include economic recessions, which affect a whole family, access to firearms, racism, bullying, drug or alcohol consumption, and media coverage of suicide. While not inevitable, existing mental health struggles can also be a factor.
And I think the other kind of risk factors that we're talking about at that family level and the school level can be things like a lot of family conflict going on. So again, if there's a lot of tension in homes, a lot of conflict, a lot of stress within the family, a lot of pressure and COVID, we saw some of that. We certainly saw an increase in children, young people going to emergency departments with self-harming or concerns around suicide. A lot of change in the family, so moving, or a lot of changes, disconnections from what's actually happening, and not feeling like there's a place for me, or not being sure about that can be happening. So times like that, we can expect that it's going to have an impact on the child. So how do we check in with them would be really important. So there might not be obvious signs, but these are some of the risk factors. And similarly at the school level, things that are not kind of going right, and that can be perceptions. So it can be the child or the young person thinking that they're not doing well, or thinking that they're in big trouble. Child that doesn't normally get in trouble but now is in trouble, and so it's really big. So that feeling of being helpless and not doing the right thing, and shame and guilt that kicks in, that can be one of the triggers or one of the signs that something's not right. And the same with academic progress, that they might have big pressures on themselves and feeling like they're not able to live the life that they're meant to be living, or they're not doing the best they could, or they're failing. And so that comes back to how schools and how families are talking about the importance of academic learning. And again, it's a fine line, I guess. Some children enjoy the challenge of learning and can do it and can manage those high expectations, whereas for other children, they can be really sensitive to that and can feel like they're doing their best but no one thinks it's their best, or they can be really sensitive about that and really struggling but not necessarily showing it. So they're the sorts of risk factors that are there that it's good to be aware of, and to be checking in, and to be really conscious around what messages we're sending to children, and remembering they're not necessarily telling us exactly how they're feeling, and how they're perceiving it might not be real. So we can easily say, well, you're doing fine at school, but the child or the young person's feeling like they're not.
So I think, Lyn, even in some families where the parents might look around and say, well, there isn't any family conflict at the moment. We haven't moved. There haven't been big changes. But you've just mentioned there's some of our real high achievers. And I worry about some of our students who are high achievers towards the end of their schooling time, where they feel, I'm now not going to get the mark that I wanted to get into this career that I hoped, and now my life is over. Or even the child who may not be the top end of the class, but they still have these dreams that they feel are now dashed because they don't do that well at school. So I think what I'm hearing is that we've got to really just be on the lookout for that sense of despair in some of our children in many areas. And it seems like school and friendships and home life are those big areas that we need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, those pressures that people can put on themselves sometimes. So personality comes into that. If we're thinking about, why do some people respond in some ways and others don't to any of these change? Some people cope with change really well. Personality comes in here. There are sort of genetic patterns. There's, if we think about mental health problems, anxiety, depression being most common, but things like autism, ADHD, they've also kind of come out in the research a little bit as well in terms of increased in suicide risk as well that come out in terms of people that have those disorders that are there. There are risk factors associated with that kind of play out in different ways. So I think, again, it's all those messages. And when you get to the end of your schooling, that's a time when the pressure really does hit. There are a lot of messages that come in from different sources. Schools can put a lot of pressure, that high expectation from schools sometimes. And I've had some of the work I do with teachers, there's that conversation around, every teacher saying, you've got to do your best in my class. What's that like? What messages young people getting about that? And how do we kind of adjust that and take into account, particularly with the COVID experience and coming back and still adjusting after COVID, what are we actually setting up there? And for some young people, that'll be fine. They need that challenge. They enjoy that challenge. But for others, it's really triggering off imperfectionism and I'm not doing good enough, or that teacher says I'm not doing good enough here, or I am doing my best and they don't notice as well.
Exactly. And I think it's human to not be good at everything. A lot of our kids might excel in English, or they might be fantastic in the woodwork section or the agriculture section. And we need to, I think, as parents and even as schools, be focusing on those with our young people, to say it's actually okay, it's normal to not be brilliant at everything, and kind of celebrate the areas that they do enjoy. And for some of our children, it's not even something at school. And that can be hard for us as parents, but really just trying to focus on areas that are our children's strengths. So, Lyn, when you talk about parents being curious when a young person says something like, I don't want to be here, or I might not be here next week or after the school holidays, how do you help parents to frame those conversations when that happens?
Yeah, I think the starting point is to hear and make sense of what the young person is saying. So hearing it to start with is really important, rather than ignoring it or thinking, they don't mean anything by it, or they're just doing it to provoke us. I think that is really, really important. So that listening is probably the most powerful communication skill and engagement tool that we have when we're working with children and young people as parents or as teachers or as psychologists, to really listen and really hear what's happening and hear what they mean by that. And it might mean more than one conversation. And I think it's also important to be able to say, I'm worried about when you say that. I really want you to be here. I want you to be, I want you to have a life that you're happy with, and I want to be here to help you with any problems that you do have. So opening that door, and obviously it occurs within a context of what's happened before. So for some parents, it's really hard to make that adjustment. And in the book, I do have a section around that adjustment from childhood into adolescence, and how we have to, as parents, we have to make a change there. We can't just keep doing the same thing that we do when children are younger. We have to buy into a different kind of relationship, I suppose. And so it's more listening, working with, influencing, rather than controlling and owning everything that's going on. So parents that can do that are obviously going to find it easier to have those conversations, but it can be a real clue that this young person is going to make some of their own decisions in their own way, and our job is to be there as a support and to be with them as they're trying to get through what might be a difficult time, and to open the door to have that conversation. And of course, if this is something we haven't done before, this is an opportunity now to go, okay, I need to stop telling them what to do and stop judging and all those things that the young person might be feeling, and start to be there as that support and try to have influence rather than control. What does that look like for one of our kids compared to another child? Or what does it look like last year compared to this year? This constant kind of evolving, I suppose, of that relationship. But your communication and your connection and your ability to be there and to have kids talking to us, that's what we want to achieve. And anything we're doing that will shut that down, whether it's at criticism, at judgment, at telling them what they should do, at ignoring things that they say that are probably really important. All of those things are really unhelpful and just those roadblocks to good communication. So it's really putting it in the context of where are we at with all of that. And that's often the hard conversations I have with parents, is if you're going to keep telling them what they should do and you're coming in with your values and your judgments, we're losing this opportunity. And often you have that window where kids are open to it. And if we don't kind of pick up on that and notice it, then it's much harder. And then we're trying to get young people to listen to us when they feel like they haven't been listened to.
I think we've got a lot better at understanding that we should not be shying away from conversations about suicide and actually asking the question, are you thinking of hurting yourself or are you wanting to die? Have you got some ideas for parents for how to frame those conversations and actually bring them up for the first time? It can be, I think a lot of us are aware in our heads that is something we need to be doing more of or not being afraid of. There may be some listeners who don't know how to do that. Could you give some ideas of how that could be done?
So I think it is important to look for opportunities, just as parents do all the time with any topic that might be a bit sensitive or needs a bit of time to talk through. So there's a lot of topics that might be similar. So sex might be one of those things, drugs might be another one of those things. So thinking about it in that way can be really helpful. Thinking I need to have the conversation. What do I need to support me to do that? So what is information that might be helpful for me to do that? So Origin have some resources for parents. The Chat Safe resource, for example, is about talking safely on using technology, using social media in safe ways for young people. That was co-designed with young people, and they have some guidance for parents, for example. But I think there's opportunities like we would do with any other topic where it might be on the news, it might be something that's talked about, something that's one of you has heard about, and then to say, I thought it'd be good for us to talk about this, or I heard this today. And, I'm hearing that young people are, sometimes think about suicide and it's, something that happens. I wonder if that's ever happened to you. And, do you ever have thoughts about dying, or, any of your friends talk to you about that?
You may notice that we have spoken about suicide and self-harm in previous episodes, but we avoid a lot of detail or mention of method. This is because there are laws in Australia, unlike in other countries, around discussing suicide in the media. There are a number of studies which have found that there is an increase in suicides following media reports of suicide. This is a relationship referred to as copycat behavior. I want to clarify again that this isn't to say you should never talk about suicide. Rather, it's the combination of the awareness of methods and watching something without support, which can lead someone to thinking of what they have just seen as an option. We are wanting to support our children through education and awareness while avoiding this copycat behavior.
Again, you know your child, you know what will work and how and when you can have that conversation, but equipping yourself first, I think, because you kind of then want to be ready for the answer. If they were to say, no, I never have, is that actually true? And we know that even people coming to see psychologists and seeking help it's hard to say that, don't always tell us that they've had these thoughts. So they may say,
because
no,
of the shame.
Haven't. Yeah, that's right. It's shame and it's fear about what people will do. So sometimes people are worried that because they've had thoughts of suicide that they're going to be rushed off to hospital, or they're going to be rushed and told you've got to go and see someone. So people are often hesitant to be able or feel they don't want to think about it as well. It's hard to think about. So be ready for what the answers might be. And then if they do say, yeah, I have thought about it, then your response is really important to that. And so really being ready and have thought about that is important.
So if a child does say, yes, I have thought about it, what do you advise a parent to say then?
I think it's something about, thanks for telling me. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm really sorry. When was the last time? Like, is it something that's now or recently, or when was it? So I think being really gentle, and I think being able to say, I'm really sorry to hear that, but not in a way that then puts guilt on the child or young person, but is an empathetic response that I have empathy. I want to hear more, and but thank you for telling me is a really important message as well, that this is okay and I want to hear about this. And then it's working again, depending on how old, their personality, how you normally deal with these kinds of things. It might be, what can I do to help? Or if it's current and it's real, does anybody else know? Might be a question. Have you talked to anybody else about it? How can I help? Is there something that's going on that we can talk about? Or can we ring Kids Helpline together and talk about it together? Is it something you'd like to go and see somebody? Is there someone at the school that you can see? Or can we go to the doctor and get some help for you? And being calm, and always easy to say, be calm when these things happen, but and that's why the preparation is really important. Really thinking it through. If they do tell us, how are we going to respond? Where are we going to have this conversation? Who's going to be around? All of those things. And have I got the time to sit with it? And then it's one conversation that you then might say, let's talk about this again later on. And then who am I going to tell? Am I going to tell the other parent? Am I going to tell anyone else? How do you get support for yourself as a parent? But if we disclose it without the young person knowing, we're going to go and tell the other partner, or we're going to tell someone else, then that can then shut down again. So thinking about all of those things, what am I going to do if I do get that information? But the first thing is to open the door and let the young person know that you're prepared to have that conversation. You want to know if this is happening, and you're not going to freak out. You might be very worried, and putting that there, that I'm concerned and I want to help you, is really the main message. And then getting your own kind of help to talk about all the stuff that's really scary and confronting. We know that parents, and again I talk about this in the book, parents who have young people that have attempted suicide have a whole range of emotional responses to that. And I know from my work with people working in schools that sometimes when schools ring a parent to say, we're worried about your child, they've said something about suicide, or they've actually hurt themselves, parents can respond in lots of different ways. And it can be that it's attention seeking or angry, or just huge panic. There can be a whole gamut of responses. And so in my work with people in schools, I'd say be prepared for that and be ready and help the parent to express those feelings, because they're that first shock kind of experience. It can come out in all of those different ways. So fear can often come out as anger, but they're really scared and shocked, but it sounds like they're angry. So listening, supporting them, coming up with a bit of a plan of how we're going to work together, and providing some guidance around that is really, really important, so that as a community we're supporting each other, I guess, and school people doing that and sharing the responsibility with parents, that we can work through this together. We've got some ideas about what we can do, but this is what we need you to do now. We need you to come so we can all work together on it. So those messages, and parents reaching out to schools as well, is important, to not doing it alone.
Not doing it alone is so important, because I think parents, you do feel as though you want to freak out because you love your child more than anything in the world. And so you become really afraid. And so it's so important, I think, then for parents to process that fear and that pain away from their child somewhere else, with your own support system, with your own counsellor perhaps, and work out what you do with that, so that when you're in front of your child, you are supportive. So I'd love you to talk about a safety plan. What is a safety plan, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's an app or a web page from Beyond Blue that's called Beyond Now that has a safety plan that can be completed. But the idea of a safety plan is that we're really looking at this person having these thoughts, or this kind of suicidality, if you like, coming into play, and we want to work out when's it coming. So what are the warning signs? Why does it come at that time? What's actually going on at that time? And then what does that feel like? Because often it seems like the thoughts just come, but often there's something that is happening first. There's a bit of a sign that I'm starting to get worried or upset about something. And then it goes into what can you do then to calm yourself. So again, that idea of distress. This is upsetting, it's distressing, and the suicidal thoughts come at that point because I'm feeling this distress and I'm feeling a bit hopeless with it all. So how can I just calm myself down? And it might be that they've got some ideas. They might say, well, I know listening to music helps me, or I know having a shower helps me, or I can go and do some gaming, where technology can be really helpful sometimes. sometimes it relaxes me, it distracts me, it just helps me to calm myself down so that I'm not going to then take those thoughts, or the thoughts are not going to get bigger, or I'm not going to go and do something and act on those thoughts. So that's that important part that they can manage for themselves, and parents can help with that and create ways of helping with that. It might be that I need to talk to someone who I feel good talking to, not to tell them necessarily how I'm feeling, but just to shift my focus a bit and to be able to feel good about talking to a friend or reaching out to someone. Or I might want to go and change the environment a bit, go for a walk, or go and do something, go and sit outside, or go for a walk to the beach or whatever. And again, parents can say, well, you can just ask me, let's go for a walk. It can become a bit of a part of this safety plan. The language around it can be, I think it's time to go for a walk, rather than I'm having suicidal thoughts. Like, it's finding ways to do that, trying to distract, catch it as early as possible so those things work. So we're not shaming the thoughts, we're not blaming, we're not saying it's bad, we're just saying this thought's telling us something. It's coming at these times, it's a reaction we have, and it's perhaps become a bit of a habit now as well, because it's been coming for a while. So we just have to do some things to manage it. So they're all the things that can be done pretty quickly and pretty manageably. If that's not enough, well, then we might think about, well, who do we actually need now to tell? If those things are not working well enough, then we might need to tell someone. And who would that be? It might be ring Kids Helpline. It might be that I need to call an ambulance. We'll need to get to the hospital. But you kind of want to ring a hospital before you turn up at the emergency department. I think I've certainly had people that have gone to the local hospital and that they say, no, we can't help you, go to another one. And so you don't really want that. So ringing and saying, this is what's happening, what do we do, is important. And then thinking about what's safe, how do we keep the environment safe, is another really important part of that safety plan. So that's where asking, if you have a plan, have you thought about what you would do? Really hard question. But then if the young person does say that, then you can at least be thinking about, well, I know that now.
If your teen is already seeing a mental health professional or doctor, talk with them about what a safe environment might look like in your teen's specific circumstances. But if you have not yet seen a professional, think in the same way as you might have when you kept your teen safe when they were very little. For example, are there things you might want to keep locked away?
And then the other part of the safety plan is the reasons for living. So it's kind of at the bottom as a reminder. It seems like, well, we should start there, but that can be dismissive. If we focus on that too much, it can dismiss the distress. You can get into that space and we've got all these reasons to live and you should just get over it kind of thing. So it can be dismissive, but it's a good reminder. It's an important reminder. And asking that question gives you a fair bit of information about how the person's feeling. So if you're doing the plan and they say, I can't see any reasons for living, again, pretty confronting as a parent, but it could be that we work together. That's an area to work on. And it could be, well, I really want you to be alive. Can we pop that down? The family's important. Pets can be really, really important. Pets can be in the safety plan. Going and patting my pet can be one of those distracting, calming kinds of things in there early on. But also the reason for living is I care about my pet and need to look after my pets, which is why it's good for parents to have giving kids responsibilities around pets, because it can become this protective factor and this reason for living. And the reasons for living can also be future. Well, we can't kind of feel like anything's going to work now, but what about future things? So again, conversations we've had before, we might be able to pick up on, that goal that you had, or, the interests that you have. Let's pop them in there. So being ready for that might be harder than we expect, and trying to put some things in there of possibilities. But that's giving you a lot of information, even as a parent working through that plan together, giving you a lot of information about how many coping strategies they have. And we want to be able to, have that as many as possible to work your way through. And I've worked with kids where there's been a list and at the time they go, oh, do I have to do this? It's like, yeah, let's just put some more down. And then they've come back and they've said that was actually really helpful. So I think the idea of the safety plan is it's very containing. It gives a real focus of what you do. It's sort of acknowledging that you're feeling this way, but there's things that we can do about this. And it's got, it's kind of the best tool we have really in terms of keeping people safe. And then you've kind of got this plan that if those things are not working, well, then we've got to take it to that next step because we're getting closer to a crisis response. But we've done all of these things, first to try and deal with it. And now we know it's kind of beyond what we can deal with at home. And we do need to get some extra help with that. So that's the benefit of the safety plan. It gives you something tangible to work with.
And so what helps parents the most when parents are really distressed about their teenager thinking about or talking about suicide? Is it that support system for the parents?
I think so. And I think acknowledgement that this is hard and unexpected and frightening, I think is really important. And so in the book, I do talk about that. And parents, like the double trauma is how some parents have described it in research that's happened before, where I feel like I'm worried about them, but I also, feel like I've got a lot of guilt and blame, self-blame. So it's the worry about them, but then it's also me not being the parent that they needed. And so trying to kind of, again, it's how we see ourselves. If we think about ourselves as owning our children and having to make them happy or, having to control everything in their life, well, then we're going to feel like that. But if we kind of see, well, this is our child or young person struggling here, and our job is to be there and support them. And this is part of what's happening for them. And not all of it is actually in my control. Like some of this is it's so complex that it can't all be in the parent's control. But what we can do is be that support and be there and the listening and the person that they can come to and create that. And that's kind of ideally what we want all the way along. But the suicidal thoughts come from a whole lot of things coming together. It's not one thing. It's not parenting gone wrong. It's not the family conflict per se. It's not one thing. It's all of these. And some people are more vulnerable than others for whatever reasons, or that idea that so many things have just built up, and seemed like I was coping really well, and then this just got to that threshold, and that can kind of happen for all of us, and it can happen for teenagers as well. The contagion concern as well. So young people who know others who have died or know of others who have died by suicide is also a concern, and we've known about that for a really long time. So again, if you've got, it's not necessarily a warning sign per se, but if you do know that there's someone in the community or a famous person, then that's a time to really have a conversation with kids around suicide risk and what it's like hearing about that person, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's got to be your best friend or anyone in your actual circle that's died of suicide, but someone that you might identify with. And this is for adults as well as kids, but kids are perhaps more vulnerable to that influence of others.
On that topic of friends, how would we support our teenager who has a friend who is talking about suicide or a friend who has taken their own life? How do we support our teens?
Yeah, these are they're two different things. So it's very common for kids to be supporting each other. And the, are you okay model is a nice model that we're reaching out and we're helping each other, but it can go too far, I think, for children and young people, where that idea is that I'm responsible now to support my friend. And so I do work with a number of young people who are part of chat groups, and then you have someone in the chat group that is talking about, I think I'm going to hurt myself, or I just want to die. And then all the young people in the group are feeling quite stressed about that. So I'm always encouraging them to, who are the adults you can talk to, but also where's your responsibility with that, and making sure that they know about the Kids Helpline, talk to them about safety planning, so that the young people themselves can be able to feel like they're offering something, but they can't be responsible for that. And then understanding that line of what point might they call an ambulance or might call someone. So I think the safety plan model can be helpful for that as well. And adults sort of talking to kids about what would we do if that was to happen, or you were part of a group, or that did happen in terms of their friends talking about it. I think it's pretty common. I think that's happening a lot. So again, the conversations parents having with kids to be able to say, this is what I'm hearing about. Is that happening in your friendship group? And I think most kids it would be happening in some way or another. If not directly, they'd be hearing about it. So it's pretty common. So I think that's the safety plan model is useful. And I want you to tell me, and I won't overreact. We'll work on it together, and we'll use that safety plan concept to work it out together and problem solve it together. But it might be that if we're really worried, that we would need to call an ambulance, or we would need to notify the parents or whatever that is. So I think we've got to have that in there. In terms of losing a friend to suicide, which is obviously very devastating. So death is something that, again, suicide is a death, but it's got a whole lot of complications around it. So it's much more like a complicated grief rather than a grief that is already difficult. So I think, again, understanding what's happening for the young person, how did they find out, what support is a school? So there's often school and community support. So how do we access that? How do we keep in contact with the school? How do we be that listening and problem-solving person with the young person? So how do we listen? How do we hear what they want to say? And then it is working with them, trying to get them to, keep connected to school themselves, to do what they can in terms of funerals or memorials or what role they want to play, and how as a parent you can support them with that. So it's the listening, and often kids know exactly what they want to do. They know that they want to go to the funeral. They know that they might want to, do something, say something, or write something, or they often know what they need. So our job as adults, whether it's parents or teachers or psychologists or other health professionals, is to kind of be with them and maybe provide them with some options, but give them a chance to make sense of it. And then over time, we know that it's a long time, it's a long impact, and there'll be different things that come up at different times, as we know with grief. So understanding grief and how we respond to grief and our beliefs about death is really important as a family. And then, but knowing that the fact that there's a suicide, often there's a lot of confusion around it, and there might be inquests or there might be police investigations, a whole lot of things going on around it. So again, working with the school, feeling supported as a family, that the school is here providing some support. They often get support from places like Headspace, and local services are often involved, or depending on the school setup, there can be people that are there helping. So I think, connecting into that, hearing what people are saying, being on the same page is really important. But again, the listening, being open, not judging, not criticising, respecting what they know, hearing what they think, and being there to help talk things through. And then when asked, have some input, not jump in with your input first, I guess, for teenagers as well. Be ready to give ideas or ask those curious questions as well. What's it like? How are you feeling? How can I help? That kind of question.
Thank you. And so, Lyn, finally, what is your hope for this generation of young people?
Yeah, look, I hope that they have hope, really. Like I feel like there's so much in the future that's uncertain, that I hope that we can hear, and even, when they're thinking about things in different ways to adults, we probably need to harness that. So I hope that adults can hear their experiences and let them be creative in thinking about what the future is going to be like, whether that's climate change, whether it's, just pressures on families, ways of living, ways of seeing themselves. I think if adults can engage in that and hear that, so that young people can be then thinking about the future that is going to perhaps be different to previous generations, I think that's what I hope for. So in my work, it's often creating that space to have that kind of conversation, or be seen and be heard in that space. And then how do we then share that with the important people in our lives that really matter? So I think that's a really important thing, is to have hope for the future and see a future that they can see themselves in.
While this isn't an easy topic, I appreciate Lyn's frankness and encouraging us to talk openly to our teens about their mental health and suicide, rather than just staying silent. If you would like to find Lyn's book or more of her resources, you can find her at drlyno'grady.com.au. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page, or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
1032. Thanks for listening.